Excuse me, brethren. You'd think Cressy said something right before we got here. She said, or right before we left to go here, she said, well, I said, well, pray that I won't be nervous. And she said, they're all friends. And I said, that's the worst kind of people, you know. But brethren, what I've got here, and the reason I printed it off is hopefully this will either be a complete flop or it'll be informative. It'll help. It'll be good for you. But what prompted this? I was reading my devotions one morning, and the devotion was about the Israeli 6-Day War, 1967, and the guy giving the devotion went over how God had miraculously worked in Israel to make that war come to pass, to where Israel, took over possession of most of the land. And so I got to looking into it because I was kind of curious, because I really didn't know what happened in the 6-Day War and just what was so special about it. And so I got to look into that, and it was. Hopefully, if this goes okay, I'll do that again next week. Next week I'll do the 6-Day War, because the 6-Day War was really, if you know what happened there and you know the background and how Israel and just the whole thing went, you could actually see God. It wasn't a bunch of coincidences. God was really looking out for Israel. But I really started thinking, well, how in the world did we get in the situation? I started hearing about Hamas, sending rockets into Israel and all this stuff going on. And so I really had to admit, I really didn't know how Israel got to the modern day situation. And so looking into the 6-Day War, that kind of drug me back into, the 1948, when Israel became a nation, which that takes you, how did we get to there? And so what I'm doing tonight is really go from 1917 to 1948, because that's really, and I'm just going to cover it real quick. This is just real fast. But brother, one thing you've got to remember, when you listen to the radio, they're real liberal, and they do not believe that Israel, they don't have the attitude towards Israel that a Christian has. I mean, you don't take you long to listen to the radio to figure that out. But brother, if you look at the verse I've got up there, Genesis chapter 12 and Genesis chapter 13, God gave the land of Canaan to Israel, period. God created the heavens and the earth. So this is God's earth. And if God wants to give something to somebody, he can. And the only people in this world that have a title to any piece of property is Israel. We're just sojourners and pilgrims here. If the Chinese can defeat us, they get America. If the Russians can defeat us, they get America. But the Israelis, the Jews, they have the right to claim Canaan as their homeland because God gave it to them. And you have to keep that in mind whenever you're listening to the news, because they don't believe that. And so as a Bible believer, we need to look at it as the fact, hey, that is God's promised land to the nation of Israel, and they have every right to be there. They have more right to be there than we have to be here. All right, and then the next verse, if I can make this thing work, there, Exodus 37, about the dry bones, and there's several passages that go with this, but I just picked one. God promised that he was going to bring Israel back into the land. Now, the promise has not been, they're back in the land now, but we haven't seen the fulfillment of everything that Ezekiel talks about. But God told him, he said, I will bring you back from the heathen nations back into Israel. And that's what we're seeing. That's what we're going to discuss tonight and try to cover pretty quick. So there on the first page, in 70 AD, we're all pretty familiar with the fact that in 70 AD, Titus came into Israel. He destroyed the temple, and the temple was destroyed, and that was it. Well, then later on, 60 years later, the Jews were still in Israel and the land, and what happened was they kept revolting against the Romans. And so in 133 AD, the Romans came in, subjected the Jews again, and kicked them out of Jerusalem. They said they basically made it off limits for any Jew to be in Jerusalem, and they forbid them to be, to live there, have any commerce, to do anything. Basically run them out of Jerusalem and told them to stay out. So since then, since 130 AD, up until 1948, basically the Jews have just been homeless, living wherever they go. Now, on the next page, if you'll look, I'm going to start World War I, because when World War I starts, if I get behind or ahead of y'all or whatever there, when World War I starts, that's when you start seeing God setting the stage for Israel to go back into the land. The more and more I looked into it, you could see it wasn't just a bunch of happenstance things happening. It's sort of like a chess game. You can see God's just sort of getting things lined up to accomplish what he wants to do. And God works at his own pace. But in World War I, what you have is basically Russia, Britain, and France were against Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. If you look at the Ottoman Empire, it's down around Israel, in that whole area. That was basically run by Turkey. And the war, it's like most wars, it starts over territories. The British, the empire was growing, but the Ottomans were making it hard for them to get to India, to get to Australia, and all that stuff. They had already built the Suez Canal in the 1850s, and yet that's right through Egypt and right through the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire they would keep giving them trouble about it. They let them build it, but then they started giving them trouble. And so anyhow, as the World War ground on, and France and England saw that they were going to win. I've got listed there three commitments that Britain made. The first one was in 1915. What they did is they promised the Arabs that if they helped them, if they sided with Britain and France and Russia against the Ottoman Empire, they would basically make the Middle East an Arab nation. That was the first commitment they made. And the Arabs still, when you get online, if you look at some of this stuff, what you'll see is the Arabs, that is a sore point with them. They hold the British in disdain because they made a promise and didn't stick to it. The next one in 1916 was the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And what France and Britain did secretly is they divided up the Middle East. Here they've already told the Arabs you can have it. Then what they do the next year is they get together and they start making plans when the war's over how they're going to divide up the Middle East. And that's where you get Syria. That's where you get Lebanon. That's where you get Iraq, Iran, basically dividing up Persia and the Ottoman Empire. And then finally, the one that everybody mentions is the Balfour Agreement of 1917. And this irritates the Arabs too, because what the British did is they made a commitment to the Jews that they would look favorably upon the Jews establishing a homeland in the land of Palestine. And the Arabs were completely, there was no discussion about that. They didn't even come to the discussions. When the UN started to talk about it, they boycotted them. They were absolutely against the Jews actually having a homeland of their own, especially. The Britain actually offered, before they talked about Palestine, they offered the Jews a homeland in Uganda. And the Jews said, forget that. This is where we're supposed to be, in Palestine. They were not going to Uganda. And so when you look online, when you start reading about Israel, the Palestine, they call it Palestine, when you start reading about, the Arabs are going to bring those three documents up because they are a sore point with them, and they constantly bring it up against the British and against Israel. Okay, after the war, when the war was over, and right now I'm just trying to get you situated so you understand how the landmass got set up, but after the war and all the treaties and everything were done, this is how the Middle East looked. Europe, basically the way you know Europe now, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and Bulgaria like we know it, and Austria and Hungary became separate countries. That all was part of this, but I'm just worried about, or just concerned about, the Middle East. And if you look in the Middle East, France takes over Syria. Britain has Iraq, Jordan. It's called Transjordan. Eventually it's called Jordan. And Palestine. The French have Lebanon. And then the rest of the countries, the ones in yellow, Britain is kind of monitoring, but they're not a mandate. And so The Arabs didn't like the way it was divided up because they didn't have a say-so in it. Basically, Britain and France divided up the Middle East, and they talked to the UN came up with it, and so, but that's how it ended. That's the way we're pretty much used to seeing the Middle East now. All right, next page, next slide. All right, this is Palestine proper. When the Brits and everybody in the Middle East were talking about Palestine, that first slide there, that is the piece of Palestine that we're talking about. But when they finished up, this is what happened. What you have is they gave the big chunk of it to Transjordan. And the British did this because they found themselves in a problem because what was happening, yes, they wanted a friendly nation down there. The whole reason they were pushing for the Jews is because they wanted somebody down there near the Suez Canal so they didn't have to worry about the Suez Canal so much. But then what happened is they also needed the Arab oil. And so what they did is they gave Transjordan, they gave it to the Jordanians, and they gave them a big chunk of Palestine just to placate them. And that's why you see Jordan is where it's at now. And it's like typical politics. All they're trying to do is they're trying to please everybody, but they're basically offending everybody. But the bottom line is for us, when you see Palestine, what you see in the second slide, let's see, the next slide, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, I'm sorry, that slide. Well, I can't back up. Yeah, so Palestine proper is what we know as Israel now, and that's the way it is. All right, so that's the landmass. All right, now, what I want to cover now is the people, how, just basically the Jews. Now, like I said, the Jews were kicked out of Jerusalem itself in 130 A.D., and the bulk of the Jewish population is in Central Europe. And that map there gives you a good idea. Russia, or Soviet, it's Soviet Union now, but back then it was Russia, had over 2.5 million Jews living in Russia. Germany had over 500,000. Poland had 3 million. Now, this is around 1933, okay? Before, just about the time Hitler came into power. 1917, the population was still about the same. I think it was, just right at 9 million. This is 9.5 million Jews in Central Europe in 1933, and 1933 is when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Okay, and okay, and then so you've got the biggest mass of Jews are in Central Europe. They've been dispersed as a nation for 1,800 years, and they've settled into these nations. But the thing is the Jews don't assimilate into a country. They stay pretty much separate. If you watch most other people, when they move to a new country, what happens is they become Americans, they become Canadians, they become British or something like that. They basically give up their national identity and become the nation that they move to. But the Jews, because of their religion, even though they might be Americans, they might be Canadians, they might be whatever, they tend to stay separate from the general populace, okay? And there's two reasons for that. One is their religion, okay? Their religion, because of their food and everything else, they have to tend to stay separate from the Gentiles. They see themselves as Jews, we're Gentiles, and that in itself tends to make them separate. And then the other thing is their language. Israel has done something. Let me see is it the next slide? Yeah. I was looking it up about Hebrew. Hebrew, and what they say here, it says historically, it is talking about Hebrew, it's regarded as a language of the Israelites, Judeans, and their ancestor. It is the only Canaanite language still spoken and the only true successful example of a revived dead language. And so the Jews have maintained, despite being dispersed amongst the Gentiles for 1,800 years, they've maintained a separate identity. The Jews are the Jews. And then secondly, they have maintained the Hebrew language. And even today, like most languages, we'll pick up words from, French, or we'll pick up words from whoever, and they'll become part of the English language. And other people will pick up, because of TV, they'll pick up American lingo and stuff like that, and they'll become part of their language. The Jews actively, even today, they've got an organization that when we come up with new words for new things, they try to make a Hebrew equivalent. They do not want the Jews as a nation, they do not want them to become Americanized. They do not want them to become, French or anything like that. They want them to stay, they want Hebrew to stay a Hebrew language. They don't want it to be corrupted. And so those two things keep the Jews pretty much isolated, and I won't say isolated, but segregated, and they don't blend into the countries they go to. And that's going to be a problem, okay? Next page, real quick, I just wanted to show you the Suez Canal. This was the main driver why Britain wanted the Jews in the Middle East. They wanted somebody down there that was that was friendly to them, because they had problems with the Arabs, the Turks, and all that. And so it was mainly a political decision. They had invested millions into the Suez Canal, and the Suez Canal was important for them to get to Australia, India, New Zealand, and the other colonies, and so they wanted to protect it. They had put a big effort into it. And what that does, this guy here, I think he's the next picture, Chaim Weizmann, and World War I, it was interesting reading. I don't know anything about explosives and all that, but they need acetone to make the shells that they shoot really high explosives. And it got so bad, Britain didn't have access to acetone. They were getting it all from America, but we just couldn't make it fast enough. And it got so bad, they could only, each cannon could only fire 4 shells a day. Well, you can't really win a war if you can only fire 4 shells. And they were worried the Germans would figure it out first. Well, this guy, he's a Russian-born Jew, Chaim Weizmann. He immigrates to to Britain, right about the early 1900s, and he develops a way to ferment wood chips and make acetone faster than Britain, as fast as they wanted it. And he basically, back then it was all trench warfare, and shells were real important to busting through the lines. And so he became, Winston Churchill, was basically, he was very, very thankful to what he did, because they were worried about not being able to win the war. And Chaim Weizmann, came up with a way to ferment acetone, and they helped them win the war. Then moving on, that's why when Manny mentioned a couple of weeks ago about the Balfour Declaration, Chaim Weizmann was able to move amongst the British. The politicians and all that, because of what he had done, and he started pushing Britain to when they won the war, to give a piece of land to the Jews so they could have a national homeland. And that's what the Balfour Agreement did. The Balfour Agreement was basically a statement that the British would do what they could to establish a national homeland for the Jews in the land of Palestine. Well, that infuriated the Arabs, but what else? All right, and I've got this next couple of slides. I'm just trying to show you Britain, out of all the countries that could have, Russia, France, there was Italy, and Britain, but of all the countries that were involved in the war, as far as on the Allies side, the best country that God could have worked through was Britain. They had the most positive attitude towards the Jews and towards Christianity, and so they were the best one. That was the French did not care about Israel having a national homeland. The Russians could care less. The Italians could have cared less. They didn't. It was the Britons that were willing, because of their Christian background, they were willing to do something for the Jews. This picture here is this is General Allenby, the British leader of the Allies. He's walking into Jerusalem. When he got there, 25 years previous to this, Kaiser Wilhelm with the Germans, when he went to visit Jerusalem, he insisted that he be allowed to go ride in on a white horse, and all the pomp and splendor and all that stuff. When General Allenby got there, he was a Christian. He got off his horse. There was a Calvary. Back then it was all Calvary. He got off his horse and walked into Jerusalem, and he said, "I don't come as a conqueror, I come as a pilgrim." He was a Christian, and he respected what Jerusalem stood for. And the next one the next slide. This, I don't really know how, I know it's true. I don't know about the story behind it. But after he took Jerusalem, the next battle was supposed to be Jericho. And to get to Jericho, they had to pass through the Michmash Valley. And that was mentioned in 1 Samuel 13. They got ready to go there. Well, the Turks just lined up cannons all the way down both sides of one side of the valley, and it was going to be a turkey shoot. And one of the officers remembered Michmash from the Bible, went and read the story. I went and read the story, and I didn't see any secret passage, but he said, he said, we should be able to climb up there, forget the horses and all that stuff. We should be able to climb up and get behind the Turks. And they did. He went and showed the general. He said, well, hey, it's better than what our plan is. And so the Brits left their horses, climbed up the backside of the valley and surprised the Turks. And a company of British soldiers took a brigade of Turkish soldiers. And they got to pass through the valley, unharmed, with no cannons, nothing else. And I've only brought those two things up just to show you the nation of Britain was they were a Christian nation, and to them, Israel was something special. The French, the Russians, the Italians, nobody else cared that. And I think God used the Brits, despite their waffling on so many commitments, that was the nation he wanted to use. And so he allowed them. You remember Lawrence of Arabia? He was a British archaeologist. He was a spy down in the Middle East. And he was supposed to be, said he was an archaeologist down there doing Bible research. He was actually a British spy down there mapping out trails and stuff for the army. And but Britain had a very big interest in the Middle East because of the oil, because of the war and all that stuff, their colonies. And I think God set that all up, the Suez Canal, the colonies in India and Australia and all that, everything, just to put Britain in a position where that area was so important to them, okay? Now, the League of Nations on the next, I might be getting lost here. There. I'm gonna jump, I'll jump to this in just a second. And like I said, the League of Nations in 1920, they put Britain in charge of Palestine. They made a it's called Mandatory Palestine. And what they did, they put Britain in charge of Palestine. They said, okay, it's your job to bring Palestine into the modern world, basically government, economics, and all this sort of stuff. Well, Iraq, there was mandatory Iraq, that worked out. Mandatory Syria, that worked out. Transjordan worked out. The one piece of land that would not work out was Palestine, and for 30 years, Britain oversaw riots and assassinations and war and everything. The Arabs would fight the Brits, the Jews would fight the Brits, the Arabs would fight the Jews fight the Arabs. It was like everybody in Palestine, it was just everybody against everybody. 30 years, the British put up with that, and finally in 1947, or 1946, they told the UN, said, we've had enough, and we're leaving. Y'all figure out what you're going to do. And so then that's when the UN takes over. Now, what I've got right here, and this is, I wanted to cover the people, and that's what I'm trying to cover here. If in the 1920s and the 1930s, and I've got some stuff listed there, anti-Semitism, I think it's anti-Semitism is how you say it, was how do you say it? Well, it's Semitism. I think you say it's Semitism. Anyhow, whatever, anti-Jewish, okay? Anyhow, was running rampant in the world. And you go to all these websites and look at trying to figure it out. But, all right, Europe was devastated after the war. They had just been completely annihilated, because of this war, and they had they were just suffering. Germany was under, the Brits and the French, the Treaty of Versailles, they burdened them with a $33 billion debt to pay back to France and to England. And the payment schedule would have stretched out to 1988. And I thought, man alive, there's no way. But anyhow, Europe was devastated financially and physically, and then you had the U.S., we pretty well walked away from the war. We were on the other side of the ocean. Then we got hit with the Depression in the late 20s. And so we had unemployment. The problem, one of the things that really brought a lot of animosity was a lot of the big corporations around the turn of the century. If you remember John Sinclair's book, The Jungle, he talks about these companies were bringing tons, thousands and thousands of European immigrants into the country, and then they were working in the meat packing plants, the textile mills, for just slave labor. And then the Depression hits, and you've got all these immigrants getting off the boats, and Americans can't even find jobs. And so what happened is they started shutting down immigration. The Americans wouldn't let anybody in, even though in the 1930s everybody could see what was happening in Germany. And there was one convention after another. What are we going to do for the Jews? Because the Germans, but nobody would let the Jews immigrate to their country because of the situations they were in. And then and the other thing was, like I said, Jews tended to isolate from society. They didn't blend in. They stayed apart. And so there was a real animosity towards Jews. This paper here started in 1923. That's 10 years before Hitler even came into power. And this paper was vehemently anti-Jewish. And it reached a circulation of like 50,000 people in Germany. And you look online, you'll see they had the papers just stapled to the wall of the building, people standing around reading it. This one here is Henry Ford, the Dearborn Independent. He bought the paper. It was an independent paper. He bought it out, and he spent from 1922 to 1927, he used that paper to propagate anti-Jewish stuff here in the United States. And he used that. He had a circulation of over 900,000 at the peak, 1925, 1926. He got sued in 1927, and that's when he stopped. He stopped. I think he just gave up the paper altogether. He got sued for slander, for libel, and anyhow, but the mindset in the world was against the Jews for all those factors. Everybody was devastated economically. There was all this propaganda being put out about the Jews, how they were, they were crooks. They always got into finances. They always stuck to themselves, and just one thing after another. So what you're seeing is, let me get the next one up. This is not a pie chart, Ken, but it'll do. Anyhow, that's the popular. If you notice there, if you look, in 1917, there was 14 million Jews in the world. 10 million of them were right in Europe, and 3 million in the U.S. And if you look at Palestine, it only had 100,000 Jews. 1933, when Hitler first becomes chancellor, he hadn't started persecuting the Jews yet. There's 15 million Jews worldwide. There's 9.5 million people had started leaving. Jews had started leaving Europe because they could see some of the stuff. One of his first concentration camps was in 1933. Anybody that opposed him as chancellor, political dissidents, he put them in a concentration camp. Later on, 35, 36, 37, he started throwing the Jews in there. But his first concentration camps were for political dissidents. The Jewish population in America was 4.2, and you have 175,000 Jews in Palestine. 1939, this is right before the war starts. There's 15 million Jews worldwide. Central Europe has dropped to 7.3. The U.S. only has 4.4. The Brits in 1939 wrote a white paper, and because they were getting so much pressure from the Arabs, they restricted immigration to Israel to 1,500 people a year. That was all that they would let, and they stopped the ships full of Jews trying to get to. They would turn them back, take them back to France, back to Italy. They limited people trying to flee Germany or flee Europe to 1,500 a year, and they stuck to their guns, and they kept taking boatload after boatload after boatload of people back to Europe and wouldn't let them get off in Israel. A boatload of Jewish people went to America, where they were going to go to Cuba and hopefully be able to eventually work their way into America. The American consulate told the Cubans, if you let them in, So then we'll cut off all ties, and they made the ship go back to Europe because politically, to let a boatload of Jews in was going to be bad for the politicians, so they sent them back. And if you look at the very last, 1947, the worldwide population is 11 million. This is after Hitler does his thing. 3.9 million in Central Europe, and then 5 million in the U.S. And you see 625,000 in Palestine. What happened? As soon as Britain left in 1947, the Jews started flocking to Palestine. They wanted out of Europe. And brethren, I think, this is me looking at it, and that's what the whole reason I wanted to, behind this, I think what God was doing with all this stuff, here Britain comes up with the Balfour Agreement and says, hey, there needs to be a land for the Jews in Palestine. They've been without a national homeland for 1,800 years. And then he puts Britain over Palestine. And then all this stuff with anti-Semitism or Semitism, however you say it, all that is basically the Jews had nowhere to go. They couldn't go to America. They couldn't go to South America. They couldn't go to Cuba. They couldn't go. They didn't go to Africa. Basically, it was like Haiti offered to take Jews, but they wanted like $5,000 a head from the UN to take them. Well, there's no way. They weren't going to pay that kind of price. And so it was like the whole world. And Hitler and them mocked the Jews, said, nobody wants you. And they made, they put it in the paper, nobody wants the Jews. And I think what God was doing, no, you're supposed to be in Palestine, and that's where you're supposed to go. And so I think what God was doing, the Holocaust, because once Hitler is defeated, the Jews are looking for one place for home, and that was Palestine. They never wanted to be dependent on America. They never wanted to be dependent on the Brits. They never wanted to be dependent on anybody else again. They wanted a homeland that they could defend, and I think that's what God's doing here. He's just boxing them in, so when he's done, they're convinced there's one place in this world for them, and that's Palestine. All right, the War of Independence. Like I already mentioned this, let's see. This is what the UN came up with. I don't know how well y'all can see that. The blue is supposed to be for the Israelis. The orange, brown, they said that, and if you see that little white dot in the center, that's Jerusalem. Jerusalem is supposed to be an international city. It's not going to be Jewish. It's not going to be Arab. It's not going to be anybody. It's going to be for everybody. But you see the orange is supposed to be for Arabs, and the blue is supposed to be for Jews. The problem with that is you can't defend narrow strips of land. Like along the water there, you see Israel's got like about a 10-mile strip. Well, you can't defend that militarily. There's no way. And so Israel, had complaints about it. And so, but as soon as May 15th, 1947, or 48, was it? May 15th, 1948. May 15th, Britain said it was pulling out, and they pulled out. They started pulling their troops out. They were done. They didn't give a rip what happened. There was wars in the streets. They started pulling their troops out. They had had enough of Palestine. And May 14th, the night before, David Ben-Gurion announced the formation of the nation of Israel. Well, the Arabs blew up, and the next day they declared war on Israel, May 15th. The Brits left. They declared war, and it took them a couple of weeks to get started. But the next 10 months, this is what you've got all the different nations as they first attacked Israel. And the first month, Israel lost 16,000 soldiers. They only had, I think, like 60,000 at the most. They lost 16,000, and the place just turned into, just a big fight. At the end of 10 months, and I'm just going to jump to, I'm not going to go over the details of the fight and all that stuff, but at the end of 10 months, Israel signed an armistice with Egypt, with Syria, with Lebanon, and who was the other? Jordan. They never signed an armistice with Iraq. To this day, they've never made peace with Iraq. And that's why Iraq, you see, they go bomb nuclear reactors, they're heading for Iraq. And it's they've never made peace with them. They don't plan on it. Okay? This next slide, this is how it ended up. On the left is what the UN wanted, or what their plan was. I'm sorry, on the right is what the UN wanted. On the left is what Israel ended up with. You got the Gaza Strip, that little red piece down there. Egypt controls that, or Egypt monitors it. In the middle, that brown piece wrapped around Jerusalem, that is Jordan. They gave that to Jordan. Jordan had the strongest army of them all, and they had control of that area, and so they kept it. And that's what's called the West Bank. The West Bank of the Jordan is Jordan's. And then Israel got 75% of the land area. Now, real quick, I've got another chart. I just want to show you what happened. It was really kind of funny. Troop strength, Israel started with 30,000 troops. The Arabs started with a little over 50,000. By the end of 10 months, Israel had almost 120,000 troops. What had happened, Morocco, Libya, all the North African and all the countries around the Arab nations kicked all the Jews out. Well, where are they going to go? They're not going to go to Europe, so they went to Israel. And so basically they were feeding the army for Israel. A lot of people got off the boat, and the next day they had a gun in their hands and they were fighting Arabs. But it worked, but it helped Israel replenish their army. If you look down at the casualties, Israel had 4,000 military deaths, and they had about 2,400 civilians. What was funny, if you look at the right side, the Arabs, they said between 3,700 and 7,000 deaths of military people, and anywhere between 3,000 and 13,000 civilians. What kind of find out is trying to figure out what in the world those, don't you know how many soldiers you got and all this stuff? They didn't know who was defecting. They didn't know, there were so many Arabs fleeing Israel, they didn't know which ones of them were their soldiers and which ones were civilians. But they said there's people just flocking out of Israel by the thousands, and they don't know if their soldiers were killed or if they just went UA. The number of Arabs, this is in the last bit here, I'm going to show you a map. This basically, where did all the Arabs go? And 800,000 Arabs fled Israel in that 10-month period. And 270,000 of them went to other nations like Iraq, Iran, and all that stuff. The rest of them, if you look at that map, lower left-hand corner, Gaza Strip, 190,000. The Gaza Strip is about the size of Washington, D.C. 190,000 Arabs fled to the Gaza Strip, and this is back in 1947. There's over 2 million Arabs in the Gaza Strip now. It's just a boiling pot of people ready to blow up. I looked up how many people actually live in Washington, D.C., and it's like 600,000. They've got 2.2 million permanent residents in the Gaza Strip right now. And it's nowhere near as advanced as Washington, D.C. And if you look up at the West Bank, 380,000 fled to the West Bank. The West Bank is about the size of Delaware. And today it's got 2.2 million, a little bit more than the Gaza Strip, but it's got over 2 million people that live there. The problem is what Israel did. Israel had 70,000 refugees, but where are they going to go? They're flat not going to go to Libya. They're not going to go to Jordan. They're not going to go anywhere else. They stayed within the nation of Israel, and the nation of Israel assimilated them into their society. I mean, but the Arabs, what they have done, as soon as the armistice were assigned, they refused to let the Arabs in the Gaza Strip move to Egypt. They had to stay there. The Jordanians won't let the Arabs in the West Bank. They cannot immigrate into Jordan. They basically lock those people there just so there'll be a thorn in the flesh to Israel. Today, I think they say, I had some notes here. Oh, yeah. Today on the West Bank, 750,000 Arabs are still classed as refugees. Out of the 2.2 million, 750,000 are still classed as refugees. On the that was the West Bank. The Gaza Strip, it's 825,000 are still. And what that means is the UN still provides aid to them, and they will not let them immigrate because they want to keep them there, just because they're a constant problem to Israel, because they do not want it. They just don't want Israel at peace. And so a lot of that, is brother, it's the Arabs. A lot of what you see going on in the news and all that stuff, Israel's in there. A lot of it is just behind the scenes Arabs putting pressure, using the Palestinians, to give Israel, nothing but a headache. So that's it. I'm finished. Brethren, I hope that was a good Bible study. I don't know what else to tell you. I think we used 3 verses. But honestly, what I wanted, and I hope it was a blessing to you, because I hope it was. But really, I knew the history of Israel up through the Bible, but what in the world happened here recently? And I just thought it would be good. I really got a blessing out of it, just myself, finding out why is Israel such a powder keg. And now you see what's going on, why it is. And 1967 is a different story. It's nothing like this, but it's just a war. But brethren, I just hope maybe that'll help you understand why things are like they are. And God was, even though it's not as obvious as you'll see in the 67 war, but God was, I think he was behind the scenes just putting all these pieces of the puzzle together so he could get Israel committed to because they were happy to stay in Europe until Hitler showed up. And then once he showed up, man, they were heading for Palestine. Once they got the opportunity, and I think God did all this anti-Semitism, whatever it is, and the economic devastation of the world and all that stuff was all done so he could make sure they went where he wanted them. And they're there now, and I guarantee you, they ain't leaving. If you've ever seen what the Israeli Defense Force, they flat are not going anywhere. Paul, why don't you pray for us again?
Thank you for Charlie's class, dear God. You bless us all. Understand it all. We're going to pray for the Jews, bless them, keep them safe, Lord. Once again, pray for salvation of our souls. Pray, oh God, all of us this week, keep us safe. And those of us unemployed, find us jobs. And just thank you again for your bless. Keep me safe in this travel and all. Just especially pray, amen.
Amen. Thank you, brother.